Greetings. I'm Josh Tyson, co-author of Age of Invisible Machines, a book that explores the learnings of 20-year conversational AI veteran and OneReach AI CEO, Robb Wilson. Each week, Robb and I bring in a guest to continue the conversation we started in the pages of our book, which is the first bestseller about conversational AI. This week on the Invisible Machines podcast, we're talking about how software is getting cheaper and easier to produce, and how that will disrupt and reshape large software companies. What will happen to incumbents like OpenTable when their space is flooded by hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller competitors emboldened by AI? We're also curious how these disruptions will affect the ways VCs invest in technology. And we're luck, because our guest this week is Jake Saper, general partner at Emergence Capital. Emergence has invested in companies worth more than $450 billion collectively, backing ventures like Zoom, Salesforce, Box, and Yammer. Jake joins the conversation as a successful investor who is quite hip to the challenges and opportunities presented by generative AI. This is a super fun and jam-packed episode, so let's dive right in. All right, well, Jake, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. We are really looking forward to this conversation.
Stoked to be here, Josh and Robb. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. And Robb, pleasure as always seeing you once again on my computer screen here.
Yes, that's where I usually am.
Yeah, that's true. We see each other a lot on this screen. So actually earlier today, Robb and I were having a conversation, not on a screen, just over a phone. And we were kind of talking about, in terms of productivity, there are kind of like four basic interactions that we have with machines. There's browse and search and communicate and program. And it occurs to us that every single one of those interactions is about to be disrupted majorly by conversational AI. I think in some instances that's already well underway. But kind of in that same moment, it seems like a lot of the analysts and investors that we talk with are still kind of looking at it in this point solution mindset. It still seems like there's a tendency to want to hold on to a moment where, you know, each little piece of software was special and had a right to be really expensive. So we thought it'd be interesting to kind of get your take on kind of where the investment world is, and then also kind of where your thinking is around this technology.
You know, this idea of enhancing our existing software with generative AI versus systemic, like rip it out. What's your thoughts there? Is this, how long is this going to last where we think that adding a motor to our bicycle is better than creating a car?
It's a good question. I mean, I can start by like framing this in the context of broader technology shifts as I see it, if that's helpful.
Sure.
So my firm Emergence was founded in 2003 on a thesis that software would move from on-premise to the cloud. This is early in that transition, but that was obviously a very fundamental technology transition. And largely that thesis has played out well. The first investment that the firm made in 2004 was in Salesforce. And I think any reason why Salesforce was able to win in that era was it was really, really hard for the incumbents to adapt. Right? It was really, really hard for Siebel, the dominant CRM system of the time, to try to re-platform the entire thing to move into the cloud. That's technically very challenging, was also culturally, I think, difficult. And so a lot of the incumbent players back in that tech transition died. This is likely a tech transition of similar or perhaps even greater magnitude than that one, but it is one in which incumbents are better suited to play, which is hard to admit as a VC who funds startups. And I think you guys obviously, it sounds like have a bet towards the newer players based upon the intro there. I think that there are opportunities for newer startups to outrun incumbents in this era, but I do think that distribution advantages are real for incumbents, and I do think that it is easier to integrate this stuff into your tech stack than it was, for example, to integrate cloud software back in 2003 for an incumbent. So you are seeing most large software players have some sort of AI-enabled version of their product. I think we're still largely in tire kicking mode to know like which of these things is actually going to have real uplift or not. there are certain ones that it's quite clear, like GitHub Copilot is really doing quite well, and users really like the product. Whether or not the broader Microsoft Office Copilot suite gets the same kind of adoption is still very much anyone's bet. It probably will vary based upon how they price and package it.
Yeah.
But zooming back out for a second, it's still very early days to know how these incumbents are riding along their bicycles. To further the analogy, I do think that there are likely going to be some soft underbellies for these bikes that give startups an opportunity to potentially outswim them or outbike them, outrace them. And I actually think, like, apropos of what you guys are into, I actually think that UX is a core area in which incumbents may be vulnerable to startups in the age of generative AI.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that. I think that is the downfall. They're not, as you say, they're prepared. I'd say, first of all, no, from a design standpoint, I don't think they are, because they've never adopted the design first. It's all paying lip service to it. So I think very few of them are actually wired to care enough about the experience to pivot. But the more concerning thing for me is the business model. Charging a lot of money for things that will be very easy to create. It's very hard to let go of a revenue stream, right? And since we always see the adoption curve being like, small at the beginning and large at the tail, there'll always be this desire to exploit the late adopters by, not dropping your prices, right? Because I mean, we're so quarter by quarter, if you're public, that, telling the market you're going to spend, 6 quarters going down so you can go back up seems to be a really, really tough message and a tough pill to swallow. I think that's even hard for startups to tell their VCs, right?
Sure.
Yeah. I think that's a hard message no matter what size you are. And so I think that's the thing that concerns me. And you mentioned distribution being a thing. I don't disagree, but I do have a lot of ideas on how I think AI will disrupt distribution. And when you fundamentally pull the carpet out of distribution, then everything's upside down, right? Because if that's not a thing, if that advantage is no longer an advantage because AI is able to find things that are good and rated well for you. In other words, we had a conversation with Gardner, and they talked about, a fifth, and I think it's going to be higher, but a fifth of the consumers' spending in the future is going to be done by robots, right? It's like we're going to have human consumers and robot consumers. And we see a lot of that today, like Kayak, and like who's actually buying. Is it the machine or is it the person? And is it just human in the loop when Kayak comes back and tells you the cheapest flight? Aren't we just a second away from just letting it decide? So if machines become buyers, then distribution becomes a given, because they can evaluate 1 million products in, minutes based on reputation and make a decision. And so now the human, condition of word of mouth, and, it was this thought that if my printer buys my ink automatically when it needs it, and it buys it from the best place that has the highest quality, and the best place that has the highest quality today is company A, but then company B comes out with something, does company A go from 1 million orders a day to 0, and company B goes from 0 to 1 million orders a day? What does life look like in that world? And it's just sort of an example of rethinking distribution. But anyway, I think I'm getting lost here, Josh.
I think it depends. Well, Rob, I can riff on a couple things you said. So first is the pricing stuff, and the second is the distribution stuff. I'll start with distribution and then maybe go back to pricing. So on distribution, what you're describing is largely like a consumer consumption paradigm. I tend to focus more on kind of B2B stuff, so selling to an enterprise. And generally speaking, when you're buying there, it's not as much of a commodity purchase. Like if you're talking about, which ink to buy, that's relatively commoditized. And so I think you're right. I think AI will play a disruptive role in distribution there, because comparing pricing and ink quantity and quality is a relatively straightforward thing to do. I think most things that will be more on the commoditized end of things, where there's not a ton of differentiation between products, are likely to be bought by AI. Right. Like right now, we already have like the Honey style Chrome plugins that hover over and tell us like, hey, it's cheaper to go to this website to buy this thing. It's very clear to see how you can get to a place where it would just go and buy it for you.
Right.
I think when you're talking about selling something that's perhaps less commoditized, and I'd argue like certain SaaS products are somewhat less commoditized. There are more things to consider, which is why you have like the G2s of the world and other things that like try to lay out the differences between things. It's possible. I think AI will likely play a role in assisting a human in making the decision, but my hunch is that a human will still play a meaningful role in the decision.
So one thing I think is a sliding scale, but if you imagine that the UIs are gone, right now we're doing it conversationally. So we've abstracted the UIs. Think of plugins on GPT, right? Isn't most of that human decision about what interface and what integrations it has, and if all of those are just taken for granted, integrations are now natural language, so we don't have to worry about are you integrated, because integrations are just a given, and everyone's just going to access it through their conversational interface. And maybe it's going to pull up graphical elements. Like, of course, it's not all going to be linguistic, but then do we start commoditizing all this stuff essentially? Like, in other words, I agree with you. The things that are not commoditized will be human decisions. But are we going to shift to a category of things? I like to give the example of like communication channels. We talk about email, we talk about WhatsApp, we talk about SMS when we have these channel preferences. But when you put a conversational AI on top of that, I don't care how you're going to tell Josh what time the meeting is. I just need you to go tell Josh what time the meeting is. And I care more about how you tell him, like say it politely or say it urgently. Use email, use whatever he uses, like whatever he'll answer. I really don't care. And so now these preferences about which email client works better for me and which messenger I like or prefer is out the window, because I'm all accessing it it's all abstracted now. And so then I don't care, right? Now just choose for me. To me, a lot of the people that are struggling to understand the impact have never really realized how much, and you said it earlier, how much UX has really been a part of the buying decisions that companies are making. They think they're buying back ends and features, but so often they're buying front ends. And if those features aren't in the front end or easy to observe in the front end, they don't exist.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, I think that UX is an underweighted part of how people have made these decisions. And my guess is that it will become less underweight in this new era as much of the stuff behind the scenes becomes more commoditized.
Yeah. We were we just did a podcast conversation with the founder of Kayak. Yeah. And he said people would always, a lot of people would comment that Kayak was just a thin UI. I think he sold it for $1.5 billion. And we're like, just a thin UI. And he's like, yeah, how important was that thin UI? It was more valuable than the underlying services it aggregated that were these complex backends, right? And it just showed like how in this day and age someone could say it's just a thin UI. It's surprising me. It just evaluating.
Well, I think the best way to think about it is like, how much differentiation does this UI create? In the case of Kayak, presumably it was enough differentiation from Google Flights and whatever else was out there that it got them to the exit they needed. I think it is true though that for many Gen AI enabled applications today, the level of UX differentiation they've achieved today does not create enough differentiated value on top of, for example, the LLM, the underlying large language model, to be sustainable.
Yeah.
I think like what's happening is that the LLM providers themselves, most notably OpenAI, their UIs, their UXs are enhancing. Obviously, a year ago, there was no ChatGPT. There was just an API, so there was no UX.
Right.
And so by definition, these applications had to exist.
Yeah.
What's happened over time is that OpenAI has taken their UX more seriously, and they've released ChatGPT Enterprise, and they're trying to be more thoughtful about what would it be like to just interface directly with us versus having to interface with an intermediate application on top of it. That being said, there's real need for particularly what we call job to be done specific use cases to have job to be done specific UXs on top of these LLMs. So I'm not suggesting that ChatGPT is the right UX for the majority of business use cases. I think it's probably not. But it is true that the enhancements they have made over the past year from a UX perspective, I think have put into question a number of the companies that have been built on top of OpenAI.
Yeah. I mean, I think linguistics is where they're focused right now. And until they bring in extra linguistics like drop downs and maps and charts and graphs, and they're starting to get there, right? There's not enough bandwidth in pure language for a lot of tasks, but
agreed.
But we're going to see that change very rapidly. And I can't help but think if I go get a table through ChatGPT, through the plugin that is OpenTable, at what point do I not care what plugin it is? Like I care now because it's a paradigm I understand. I know what OpenTable does. I'm familiar with it. But if I'm, somebody who's never used OpenTable before, why do I care what plugin? Just get me a table. I don't care who you get that table through. And I don't know how much value OpenTable now has in the world if you don't have me as the user. And more importantly, what if the restaurant owner is now going through ChatGPT to say how many tables they have available? Where does this leave OpenTable in this scenario when what they have left could be built by any developer in a week or 2 weeks? If that makes any sense, right? And you're saying like distribution, does it matter? Like, because OpenAI has the distribution, does it matter? All the distribution that they spent getting their app on all these phones, how does that help them?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. I mean, you'd have to believe that this job to be done of providing help to the restaurant owner and to the booker on getting the reservation set and having a good experience requires more workflow than just the find me a table at this time and go.
Right.
Like if it is that simple, then I think you're right. Like open table, like why does it exist? I think open table's counter argument would be there's a lot of stuff we're doing other than actually just making that booking.
Yeah.
Like there's a whole discovery and curation experience, so we understand who you are, et cetera. Now, could ChatGPT, ingest all of those capabilities? Potentially, but I think we may be in danger of marveling at the tremendous power of something like ChatGPT and forgetting that without job to be done specific UX, it may fall flat.
It might, but let's look at it from a different angle. Imagine that you could trust ChatGPT. So I know that's a big thing, but let's just say we're on that road, that Biden's like created a team, and I think you've talked about this, about the idea that countries will have their own LLMs. I couldn't agree more. I think there'll be a PBS version of an LLM. I think there'll be all kinds, but I'm 100% in agreement that there'll be a PBS LLM that we can all trust. I think the recent breakthrough with Anthropic, where they're able to now monitor the LLM and the neurons to see like when it hallucinates what area of the model, so we can now create confidence scores, like that's huge. I think the laws around this will create trust. I don't actually think they'll erode it. I think they'll create it. We're going to start to believe that the government's got our back even when they don't. And so I kind of go to this place where I'm like, all right,
Rob, that's the most positive view on the government I've heard in a while. But I'm all for it.
I know. It's either a positive view on the government or a skeptical view on citizens that trust the government blindly. But
same outcome, you're saying? Yeah, fair enough.
But I'd say that you know we're going to trust that this thing's safe, and so now my context will be in the LLM, not in OpenTable. So its ability to get the right table at the right place, that customization needs context. And OpenTable may say we have the context. I'm going to say I don't trust OpenTable with that. I trust my LLM that hopefully is maybe even on my device, right? If Apple has their way.
Yeah.
And so they're going to be at a disadvantage because they're not going to have the contextual data of my past conversations, my past interactions, my likes and dislikes. They're going to have to do this without all of that. And if they ask for that, I'm not going to give it to them because the laws are going to be such that they're not going to be able to store it or keep it, except ephemerally. And so they're going to have some super unique algorithm that suggests food to me that I would give them my life story just to get the right table. So I think they just become transactional at that point, because right now you're saying they're doing all this stuff, but all that stuff requires context and knowledge about me, context and knowledge about the restaurant, what they have to offer. And if that stuff's in the layer above it, which is new for us, that layer is so smart, that UI layer is so smart that it actually carries our preferences and context. This came from the Boeing project, by the way. We designed the cockpit, and a big part of understanding how to automate an airplane was context, and our portion of it was the flight plan. And so we knew that when you have the flight plan, then you know what features to pop up to the pilot, right? Without the flight plan, you're having to ask them a million questions. And so you just sort of assume the LLM's going to have the flight plan of your life, and then what are these services underneath them? And that's the systemic change, right? Yeah. Does OpenTable add Gen AI? Sure. But is that going to last? Is that going to carry them into the future, or does that just give them an immediate advantage for the next year or so? That all makes us believe that they're capturing the moment, and then boom, anybody that's never been on OpenTable doesn't care how ChatGPT gets their table.
Sure.
I know it's a stretch,
I mean, but I see that future on the consumer side of things. I guess OpenTable is an interesting example that you picked because it's both a consumer application and a business application, right? There's a consumer-facing portion of it, and the restaurants have this whole UX to understand, okay, what's the layout of my tables and how is that changing over time? And there's an analytics page on use. Like, I haven't actually been a restaurant owner, so I don't know what it looks like, but I'm envisioning what the OpenTable app experience looks like for a restaurant owner. And I guess this gets back to UX and the drawbacks of conversational UX. My hunch is that for most restaurants, having that information surfaced in kind of a more generic, blank canvas conversational way is going to be inferior to a visualization that's custom made for that specific use case. And so this gets back to the concept of like, is ChatGPT going to be the right application for everybody? They may have a lot of the information and context to be the co-pilot for the consumer, as you described, if they live much of their life in the application. But if you're the business user, you're probably going to want a UX that's designed for your specific job to be done.
But what if those components are micro UIs, right? So yeah, maybe I want to see a map of my, I want to see a map of my restaurant, and I want to see which tables are available in a geospatial way, right? I don't want to see this in a linguistic way. The table to the right of the table 3, right. But what if it can conjure that up on the fly, right? Now we're talking about a graphical UI. You say those are custom. They're not custom. They're one size fits all for every restaurant. What if it truly is now custom for your restaurant? It has your table mapping, and those things are conjured up on the fly, which we can see happening right now using DALL-E and just coding on the fly, right? So if you have a language that's a combination of graphical UIs and language together, and the language part is just navigating you to those graphical pieces, right? So you don't have to remember, how do I get to the part. We got to log in, then you go to the tab on the right, then you go 5 tabs down, you'll see blah, and then click on that, then go to the search bar. No, you just tell it, hey, I added a new table to the floor plan. Great. Pops up a UI, drag the table where you want it, drag it, got it. When you wrap the system holistically with AI, you start to attrit the system. The more data you have, the more unnecessary the system becomes, and you never rewrote the code. You never even looked at the code to understand it. You just looked at the data in, data out. And it's sort of like if we have AI operating our software, at some point, that software gets expired. We don't even know when. I know it sounds crazy, but it's all doable.
Yeah, it is all doable. I think it's all doable. The question is, how is it likely to happen from like a software company perspective? Which is, again, like as a VC, I'm thinking about it less in terms of like what's the technological possibility and more like what are the businesses that are likely to emerge. And the reality is, like, the history of software, the arc of history, bends towards specialization. Like software has started very generic, and you had a database effectively, and then you had job to be done specific databases like a CRM, which is really what a CRM started as in many ways. And then, there are CRMs just for specific industries. Like Viva Systems, one of our portfolio companies, is a pharmaceutical focused CRM. And that feels kind of niche-y, but that company's worth north of $20 billion now, just doing that kind of specialized version of it. The argument isn't like, can Salesforce do something that's more specialized? Or to use the analogy here, can OpenAI do something that's more specialized? It's, are they likely to?
Yeah.
Right? Because all a company has ultimately is focus. Like that's how you prioritize the resources you've got. And so the argument I would make is that I think it's unlikely that a company like OpenAI would build out the level of data integrations and UX specifics necessary to serve the restaurant owner, as well as a company that is using their own LLM or maybe borrowing OpenAI's LLM and building specific tooling for that audience.
I 100% agree with that. I think that's absolutely accurate from my perspective. What I see is a bunch of companies popping out, and I think we see a lot of VCs now talking about funding all these little Gen AI startups, right, that are going to go and compete with all the open tables out there. There's going to be like 1,000 different versions of open table, and there are going to be 2 or 3 guys in a garage because distribution's handled and customer service is handled and automation is doing their billing and they don't have to lay off anyone. And so and how is this happening? Well, these VCs that are funding it are going to make it happen because, if it's a $3 billion fund and they're going to give $500,000 to each one of them, that's 3,000, 6,000 little guys hitting the street that all can create better experiences. And then the question is now, how does OpenTable compete with 300 of these? And I don't think it's going to be OpenAI. I totally agree with you. It's going to be, Bob and Jeff in their garage that created a very specific experience around booking a table and they're probably going to be chefs. They're not going to be developers. They're going to be chefs that understand how to experience food, how to pair, your tastes and likes and your past food and maybe your lunch with your dinner,
Yeah, totally.
It's not like, who cares if they know how to
it's
code?
getting better. It's getting better for everybody.
Yeah.
I agree. And like, it's also like, it is it's an exciting kind of knock-on effect of this revolution, which is like, this should equip people who have not traditionally been software builders to build software.
Yeah.
And therefore, people that are coming from domains are going to be able to build the thing they know they need. My hunch is that the very best companies, the companies that really pop out, you're going to have the domain expert, and you're also going to have someone who traditionally understands software, because there is still going to be a bunch of data integration stuff in the back end. There's still going to be a bunch of enterprise security stuff you're going to have to figure out. Like, this doesn't like magically make the difficulty of building software go away. I think it just makes a lot of the initial building blocks much easier.
I agree. I think to demonstrate that, you said CRM. I like to always talk about the disruption of CRM because everybody thinks it's so big and it feels like a search engine. I feel like I'm talking to people 2 years ago when they said Google owns the search engine space and there's no threat until there was one. So I want you to imagine that every conversation that we have, including this one, an LLM is pulling out all of the biosketch, like data about you that you said, your name, blah, 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 blah. And it's just creating a biosketch. A biosketch could be, think of a LinkedIn page or a Wikipedia page or a resume, right? So it's a document. It's not a structured table. And so what's beautiful about that is I don't have to predict what I need to collect on you before. I don't need a whole team of data scientists. I don't need a schema. I don't need tables. I just need a document. And that's going to go into a vector DB. And then anytime I want to find out about your likes or dislikes, I'm just going to go there. And I'm going to skip all the traditional software. I'm not going to need SQL connectors. I'm not going to need any of that because I've collected more information on you in 2 months of talking to you and probably in one conversation than any of these companies have in their structured databases. So somebody still has to build the ability to store that unstructured data, that biosketch, and the ability to mine that biosketch. But that's so much easier than implementing Salesforce and trying to build all of these queries on top of it. It's something one guy is going to be able to knock out in a couple of weeks. I do think that logic, that programming logic, that critical thinking will be necessary. But I think it just became not just equal to Salesforce, but he's going to be able to do things, or she, that you can't do with Salesforce today.
I think that's likely true. I think there's an even more fundamental point that harkens back to an earlier part of the conversation, which is that Salesforce has a massive business that it has to defend.
Mm-hmm.
And let's just say for a second that it's true that the better way to do CRM is through a conversational interface. I'm not saying it necessarily is, but instead of having the WYSIWYG point and click approach that is standard for Salesforce today and most of SaaS, let's say that like more of the open canvas chat interface is the superior way to do CRM. If that were true, the issue isn't can Salesforce do it, because they can afford to hire whatever they want in terms of development.
They bought Slack. I think they already know it's going to happen.
Sure.
Yep.
But the question is like, would pivoting the business is there a real innovator's dilemma or counter-positioning challenge for them? And I think there is in that case, right? Like, because you have to maintain the massive amounts of revenue you currently have. And if you all of a sudden say, hey, we were wrong, this is the better interface, use this one, you're putting most of your legacy revenue at risk and therefore the business at risk, which is why disruption happens.
Yeah, one of the guys who used to work with me in a prior company is now the lead designer of Slack. And it's interesting how, these two companies trying to figure out a complete different version of the future is going to play out, because it's been, I don't remember who said it at Salesforce, but they said Slack will be the new interface for Salesforce. But I think they're struggling. This is my opinion. He didn't say this to me, but my opinion is that they're struggling to figure out how to maintain that. Like, they've got a whole huge ship moving towards making money a certain way. Trying to get Slack in there, at $8 a user, is a really tough shift for them to make. Even though they bought it, right? Even though they made the big move, it's hard. It seems challenging for me that even with that big move, which is bold, I would say very aggressive, hats off. But can they give Slack the room to really cannibalize that other business? And I guess we'll see. But
I think it's hard. It's hard because you have to defend your core thing while also be thinking about the future, and sometimes those two things are at odds.
Well, how does the idea of like this thin UI layer, if you apply it to the B2B SaaS world, you mentioned like these bigger companies are in position to really integrate AI well, but I think at the root of that is getting all these different components, these legacy systems within them to communicate with one another. And so the paradigm starts to shift, right? Where like instead of wanting to create the most complete software in a little black box that you maybe let talk to some other components in limited ways, it seems like there's more value in being open and able to connect with other things. But that is like such a fundamental shift to like what a product is. Can that be reconciled? Like how do investors go about making investment decisions in a world like that, and also a world where it's long-term investments that will really have the bigger payout? It's not like there's ways to make financial gains in the short term using generative AI, but they tend to be kind of dead-end solutions on a pretty rapid timeline.
Like I can tell you the framework that we have been using around this tech trend and investing around it. We are still in this phase of, the reality is that these products have only been accessible to builders for a year or so. And so we're still in the very, very early days. And so as a result, a lot of the applications that have been built on top of this technology add questionable levels of value on top of the technology. And so the simplest way to think about it is, how much value are you, the builder of this product, adding on top of the LLM?
Right.
If the answer is a ton, then your thing is probably defensible and going to live for a while. If the answer is some, then like the underlying LLMs are getting so good and those UX experiences are getting so good that like you may not be long for this world. And so like that's the very simple framework that we've been using.
Yeah, I like it. And I think you could divide it into like value technically or more value experientially, because I think the design value is where...
Sure.
Yeah.
When I say value, I actually mean like, again, think about the business lens, like how much end business value are you getting?
Right. Good point. Yeah.
So like, which is a combination of those two things. It's the technical, like what is the innovation you're adding on top of the LM, but it's also the UX, and because the value could be, this is just way faster for my sales rep or support rep or whoever's using this to do it versus going to the LM. And that may be a ton of value.
Yeah.
Which could be, defensible. If it's like, hey, I've got a marketing person and it saves them a little bit of time to use one of these marketing-focused Gen AI tools. But the reality is like we get 80% of that value, and it only takes, a little bit more time to go straight to ChatGPT to get the information. That may not be as defensible. One thing I do think that is like kind of undersung or under-discussed in this world, which is like, this is not a popular thing to say, but I believe it to be true. I think that boring old SaaS workflow is still going to be very important in this next era. Because I think that boring old SaaS workflow is a core part of the differentiated value add on top of an LLM. So like, I'll give you an example. I work with a company called Ironclad, which is a legal contracting software. So if you are drafting a contract, it helps you draft the contract, and you can negotiate the contract back and forth with your counterpart, as well as internally get approvals and such, and then you can finally sign the contract within the product. There are a ton of Gen AI enabled legal companies now that are helping you do things like highlight a clause and say, make this clause mutual. And then the AI comes back and actually edits the clause. And it's astounding. Like a lot of these companies that popped up in the last few months have functionality that can do that. So does Ironclad, by the way. They have their own versions of this. But what I think will ultimately make a company like Ironclad stand out relative to all the people who have come up with similar point solutions like that is that the job to be done of drafting, negotiating, and ratifying a contract is much bigger than the narrow concept of help me iterate on a clause, give me AI, advice on a clause. There's like a ton of boring SaaS flow necessary to do that, including things like permissioning. I need to make sure, like, Rob, do I have your permission to approve this type of contract? But actually I need to go to Josh to get approval for this kind of contract. Like, it's the boring old stuff that's required to build great, durable, dependable enterprise software that is not really about generative AI.
Yeah.
That I think will ultimately be value on top of these LLMs.
We call that symbolic AI, right? It's the decision the rigid decision making that we have to put into it, we're not going to have a world where AGI, and I guess we can kind of transition to the AGI side of things. We're not going to have AGI without symbolic and neural AI. I think that, you know, we just launched a podcast with, you know, Mr. Gertzel, who popularized AGI as a term. And he's always professed that symbolic and neural combined, because, and I think you can argue this point in an extreme way, which says that if we use AI to make decisions for us, in other words, asking ChatGPT to make decisions for us, not just talk, but make decisions. Where should I go for lunch? That seems maybe pretty benign, but when we realize that one of the dangers of AI is that it becomes more concerned about self-preservation, right? It starts to think, I've got to protect myself. And there's a lot of people that would have said, well, just don't train it that way. Don't train it to protect itself and we'll all be fine. Except when it's being trained on watching our behavior, essentially on our words, and our words protect ourselves, then without intention, you are training it to protect itself because it's mimicking human behavior. It's not symbolic, right? It's basically mimicking what it's seeing. And so it's going to make the decisions then that are based on the kinds of decisions we make as human beings, which will involve self-preservation as a component of it, potentially, without alignment, right? Of course, there's always the option that we align it out of there, but I think that that's where the danger comes. What if you miss it on something critical? So there is this point to saying, like, neural AI should be there to talk. Symbolic AI should be there to make critical decisions, to your point. And if that symbolic AI is just simply an algorithm that we've coded, fine, as long as we know what the outcome is. And when it comes to contracts, you don't want contracting decisions to be made neurally. You want them to be made symbolically. The thing I would say is, though, it may not need to be made by a human symbolically. A human can design the rules and ask a machine to follow the rules it designed. So it's still a human doing it, but it doesn't mean that the human has to look at every single one. But I think what you're saying, I've said in other ways, which is there's a lot of room for companies to weave between symbolic and neural AI a solution that is a really elegant combination of both of these that give us the security of decision making, but also this beautiful, easy to use UI with components, so that we don't have to log in to SharePoint anymore and try to find out where that contract is that we're working on and who commented on it last, and I don't really care, and whether it was signed or not, just something else should take care of that. And you should just be able to say, hey, pop up the contract for blah, blah, blah. And it should pop up given that you have permission to do it. To your point, that permission being symbolic AI, not neural, oh, you seem like a good enough guy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's just a lot of skills, just an army. It's like an app store of these things. And then we have generative and open AIs of the world that will just be our navigation of these apps.
Yeah, I think that's very possible. One thing I wanted to comment on, Rob, that one of the first comments you made was around pricing. And folks worrying about, being reluctant to drop pricing. I think there's an even more perhaps foundational change or threat that could be afoot here to an incumbent, which is that the pricing model itself could change.
Right.
So not just the levels could drop, but SaaS software today is charged largely on a per seat basis. There's been a growing popularity to also charge on some sort of usage basis, which is interesting. but I think that like you're starting to see some experimentation on about people charging on an outcomes basis.
Yeah.
So instead of charging, on how many people you have using it or how much you use it, rather like, what did it achieve?
Yeah.
Did it achieve the thing that we wanted to? And if so, pay me on that basis.
Yeah.
I think as this software starts to get good enough that it replaces things that were traditionally performed by services, right? Like jobs that were traditionally done by people because they were too complex to do with software are going to increasingly be possible using software.
That's a fascinating idea.
The question is, do we adapt those business models, right? Because a lot of services are charged on like some deliverable. Like I'm hiring you to go do this thing for me.
Yeah.
And so it's very possible that the software we buy will start to be hired on the basis of, did you achieve the thing I asked you to do?
Yeah, I think Gertzel would be just nodding vehemently right now if he heard you say that. He thinks that whole transaction will be blockchain based, and that the whole payment system for outcomes will be handled in a crypto decentralized way. So yeah, that's what I think Singularity Net is pretty much all about, that he created. I 100% agree with you that I'm not going to pay you to try. I'm going to pay you to do. And the idea there is what's inherent in that is that now you can't hide the quality. So now when we look at reputation, right, we're not talking about surveys that are done afterwards. It's built into, we know inputs and we know outputs. We know how many people went in and didn't get charged, and we know how many people went in and did get charged. And so you can't now hide the reputation, which means now the system can immediately choose the next best thing just based on usage alone. And somebody who creates an algorithm like you're talking about, or a skill like you're talking about, that comes out on one day where the other skill is getting 1 million a day and yours is getting 100, it now rises to the top because it's a ratio. Now there'll be a bunch of gaming the system and blah, 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 but that'll get handled. But I think you're 100% right. That's probably a lot sooner than it all feels, because it's a solution to a pretty big problem. That's it's fascinating.
You're already starting seeing some folks experiment with it. There's some customer support companies that are starting to experiment with, like, we'll charge you if our AI resolves your ticket. So not how many tickets are we processing or how many seats you're buying, but did we resolve your ticket?
Man, what an easy buying
Still
decision.
very early to know if that's going to work.
Yeah.
It's early to know if it's going to work or not. And there's risk, right? Because you don't know if the thing is going to be good and piss off your customers or piss off your customers. Like there's risk, right? But I think it's a very aligned business model if it starts to work.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about just like a possible future where reputation is kind of the thing globally, right? Like not just within companies or surrounding their products, but along with being like companies having a score, there's like customers get scores too. Like you can't, like people won't be able to kind of game the system by, going into an interaction pissed off, wanting to talk to a manager. Like everyone kind of has to play in this, in this way, which could have, both good and bad outcomes, but certainly some good ones.
Yeah, I think there's also the AI arbiter, right? Which is, to your point, it can help figure out whether these things are fraud or not, or because we can live in grays now. We don't have to live in black and whites, right? We can find out if people were truly satisfied, with the experience, because we have conversation to do it, to say, hey, how you think, just write a brief sentence on how happy you were, and you'll get whatever 5% off. And
there's like an interesting idea too, where like you have these automations running, and then you're hoping that they meet their goals in order to get paid. But maybe there could be people on all sides of the equation chipping in to help get it across the finish line. It could be someone who works for the company that created the automation. It might be an employee within the organization that's using it. It might even be the person on the customer end who just suggests, like, hey, I've been through this enough times to tell you that it might be better to do it this way. And then there was like a way, I mean, obviously like everyone could maybe share
Yeah.
in some of the profits there too, which sort of obliterates the clean little lines that we draw.
Yeah. In my view, OpenAI is like just a channel. You're going to create this plugin skill, and to your point, that's going to be an experience, and that's going to be a curated, well-designed experience by somebody who knows what they're doing, so that you're not automating what you do, but you automate the way you ought to do something. And you're going to subscribe to that like you would buy a book and subscribe to their system. And you're going to subscribe to updates to that because they're going to constantly be improving how that works and how that experience is. But I like this other idea that, you know what? No, you're not. You're just going to pay for the outcomes, and they're going to keep increasing the quality of it so that they get better and better outcomes. And that's how they're going to get paid. So all they're going to be thinking about every day is, how do I get better outcomes out of this thing? And that any attempt to game the system will put you in jail. It's not literally, but maybe literally.
Exactly. Well, I mean, it depends on the use case, right?
Yeah. But just like Amazon, if you try to game the ratings, like your product just gets banned.
Right.
So
exactly.
Wow.
Cool.
We covered a lot. We did. I think we just redesigned the whole future of software industry as a whole.
Economy.
Yeah, and the economy.
Yeah.
And the economy more broadly.
SAS, take note.
You get an award.
Well, excellent. Thanks for taking the time, Jake. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
It's been a lot of
course.
fun.
Thanks for having us. It's fun.
It's great.
Hey, thanks again for tuning in to Invisible Machines. Don't forget to follow Invisible Machines wherever you get your podcasts so that you can hear new episodes as soon as they drop. You can also watch this podcast on the Invisible Machines YouTube channel. Thank you so much to everyone who listens to this podcast, and especially to those of you who leave comments, because we've received a lot of really useful commentary that has helped us shape this podcast as we move forward with it. Thank you, as always, to our producers, Elias Parker, Kate Timchenko, and our video editor, Michael Litvinov, for making this podcast look and sound wonderful. We look forward to catching up with you again next week, right here on Invisible Machines.